Hello my dear friends, you're on the Military Summary channel and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 18th of September of 2025. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. The Russians, since the beginning of August, have already launched at least three major offensive operations. The first one took place at the beginning of August to the northeast of the city of Pacrovsk, to the northeast of the entire Pacrovsk agglomeration, and as a result of that offensive operation, the Russians managed to break through Ukrainian defense to get the second Donbas defense layer and to force Syrsky and to force Ukrainians to bring additional units, the best units they have, with the purpose to stabilize the situation. And that offensive operation allowed the Russians to intensify their activities in the Zaporizhzhia direction. And right after basically the end of a very short but very effective Pacrovsk offensive operation, the Russians launched the Zaporizhzhia offensive operation, and as a result of 2 or 3 weeks of clashes, the Russians managed to improve their position significantly, and they took under control probably several dozens of villages and settlements to the west of the river of Mokre Yali. All in all, somewhere at 12th of September, the Ukrainians realized that the situation in this area is very difficult and they redeployed additional forces. And now we see that the Russians are getting slower and slower. Not saying that the Russians are going to stop their offensive operation. Most likely they will try to take under control the villages of Poltavka and Okhotniche, but now this is not the most important point. It doesn't matter basically, because right after the Ukrainians redeployed additional forces in this area, this time with the purpose to stabilize the situation, to stop the Russian offensive operation, the Russians launched the third offensive operation, and this time they launched this offensive operation in the northeastern part of the Kharkiv region. And we start getting first reports about additional changes on the ground. And now the question is, do the Ukrainians have enough of forces, enough of reserves to bring them here with the purpose now to stabilize this area? Currently, I have some doubts about this, because this is exactly the point of Russians. They don't want to attack walls, they don't want to attack strongholds, they don't want to suffer losses anymore. The Russians decided to attack just in those directions where they can get additional progress. If they see that there is no reason to attack, they will not do this. So the clashes in the northeastern part of the Kharkiv Oblast continues, and according to information we have, during the previous 24, 48 or 72 hours, the Russians managed to improve their positions significantly. First of all, the Russians finished the battle for the most important part of the city of Volchansk, for the industrial zone that is located on the Ukrainian side of the river of Volcha. So this complex was taken by the Russians, and the Ukrainians were forced to fall back in the southern part. The southern part of the city of Volchansk is under very heavy fire. The Russians attacked this territory with missiles, with aviation, and it seems that Ukrainians will not be able to hold their positions for a very long period of time in this area. Furthermore, the sources are saying that currently there are very heavy clashes for this forest, and the Russians are getting closer and closer to the settlement of Sinelnikova. So it seems that the Russians are planning to intensify their offensive operation in this area, and it seems that the Russians are planning to take the settlement of Volchansk under complete control during the next several weeks, maybe months. Another important offensive operation was launched by the Russians in the northeastern part of the Kharkiv region from the border. So these are the changes on the ground that you can see right now in front of your screens. According to information we have, yesterday the Russians improved their position significantly, and as a result of offensive operation, the Russians managed to get the outskirts of the settlement of Odradne. And today we got report that the Russians managed to capture the village. This was reported by pro-Russian resources, and neutral mappers confirmed about progress on the ground along the border. So now we see that the Russians are trying to advance in the southern direction. Furthermore, according to geolocations and according to FPV drone attacks that took place in the northeastern part of the Kharkiv region, we believe that the Russians most likely will try to attack from the south, from the settlement of Dvorishna, in the same direction. And the focal point of both attacks is the settlement of Kolodezny. The Russians, as we discussed just a minute ago, they will continue offensive operation in this area until they can until they can move, until they can take villages, until they don't face any resistance from the Ukrainian side. But the thing is that whether the Ukrainians have enough of resources to stabilize the situation and to show this resistance, because there is a very high chances that Ukrainians will not be able to show any resistance almost until the city of Chiguyev, which is already a part of the Kharkiv agglomeration. Furthermore, currently the heaviest clashes are taking place for the territory of the city of Kupiansk. The Russians continue offensive operation in its northwestern part. This information was confirmed by the neutral mappers. Furthermore, the Russians continue their offensive operation along the road N26 in the vicinity of the settlement of Stepova Novoselka. This information, as for this progress on the ground, was confirmed by pro-Ukrainian resources and by pro-Ukrainian mappers. So the Russians continue offensive operation, and according to information we have, during the previous 72 hours, the Ukrainians redeployed in this area the 3rd Assault Brigade of the Armored Forces of Ukraine. And you know that this is very important piece of news, and the importance of this news is that this 3rd Azov Brigade isn't fresh. They are not fresh. This brigade was involved in the Ukrainian counter-offensive operation in the Liman direction. If you remember, during the previous months, we were talking a lot about Ukrainian counter-attacks in the area of Redkadub. We were talking a lot about very heavy clashes for the settlement of Novomikhailivka, and we were talking a lot about Ukrainian counter-attacks in the area of Nadia. All those counter-attacks that took place during the summer of 2025 were carried out by this 3rd Assault Brigade of the Armored Forces of Ukraine, and without getting any pause, any operational pause to restore themselves, they were redeployed in the Kupiansk direction. And this is a very, very important signal that this time, to stabilize the situation in the Kupiansk area, the Ukrainians were forced to redeploy not a fresh unit, not a fresh brigade, but they were forced to redeploy in this direction the exhausted 3rd Brigade of the Armored Forces of Ukraine. So, of course, it is very interesting to see what is going to be next, but it seems that this 3rd Brigade will be able to stabilize the situation maybe for a week or two, but obviously due to the fact that the brigade was exhausted during the battles for the Liman direction, they would be forced to fall back from this area. And you know, maybe the main purpose of this 3rd Brigade of the Armored Forces of Ukraine is not to stabilize the situation, but maybe to maintain a corridor for evacuation of those Ukrainians who are currently located on the eastern bank of the river Voskol, around the settlements of Pishana, Novosinova, Kupiansk-Uzlovoy, Kurilovka, Petropavlovka, and so on. Anyway, let's wait and see what is going to be next, but if Russians will continue offensive operation in the northeastern part of the Kharkiv region as they did in the Zaporizhzhia direction, this will bring very big problems to Ukraine. Now let's talk about the Liman direction. During the previous 24 hours, lots of icons, lots of events were recorded in this area. According to information we have, the Russians continue their offensive operation, and it is very interesting to discuss another report that was made by the chief of the General Staff of the Armored Forces of the Russian Federation, Valery Gerasimov. He stated that the Russians they continue their offensive operation along the line of combat contact, and he stated that the group of forces west managed to answer the settlement by the name of Yampol yesterday. So this is the statement. Our troops, Russian troops, answered and are conducting combat operations in the village of Yampol. Also, he stated that the assault units of the group of forces south are advancing in the city of Siversk. So, the chief of the General Staff of the Armored Forces of the Russian Federation stated that the Russians are not somewhere around the city of Siversk, they are inside of the city limits of the city of Siversk, and currently there are very heavy clashes. As for the end of the 18th of September of 2025, we still haven't received anything that can confirm the presence of the Russian units on the territory of the settlement, but it seems that this is something like a truth. Another important thing is that the Russians answered the village of Yampol, and there are also very heavy clashes. And for example, the day first, pro-Russian resources made their changes on the ground, and they colored the northeastern part of the village under complete Russian control. As for now, we still haven't received anything, of course, that can confirm this. Let's wait and see, but it seems that there are very heavy clashes for this area, and it seems that Ukrainians are forced to fall back in coming days. Furthermore, the clashes are taking place for the territory of the village of Shandrigolova. Ukrainians control just 20 or 30% of the settlement, and most likely in coming days they would be forced to fall back as well. And the question is whether the Russians will continue offensive operation further in the southern directions towards the villages of Dobryshevo and Dirilova, or the Russians would continue offensive operation in the western direction with the purpose to get the river Voskol and to cut the Barova direction from supply and support. So a lot of questions. We see some kind of panic among Ukrainian units and forces that can lead to unpredictable consequences. Now let's talk about the Pacrovsk and the Constantinovka direction. During the previous 48 probably hours, the president of Ukraine, Zelensky, came to this area with the purpose to meet with soldiers, to give them rewards, and to discuss the current situation on the ground. Because the situation is very difficult. We see that today is already the 18th of September of 2025, but Ukrainians still haven't managed to stabilize the situation about the area of Russia's breakthrough in the northeastern flank of the Pacrovsk agglomeration. This counterattack is already taking place for 1 month, and we see that Ukrainians still haven't managed to do anything. The Russians most likely managed to stabilize the situation. During this Ukrainian counterattack, the Russians managed to improve their position significantly in the Zaporizhzhia direction, in the Siversk direction, in the Kupiansk direction. The Russians haven't lost their main, let's say, foothold, and most likely after this stabilization, the Russians will resume their attempts to cut the Shakhovo pocket completely. As for the city of Constantinovka, now the Ukrainians are trying to bring additional forces in this area also for destabilization. And this video we can see how Russians, as a result of reconnaissance operation, managed to discover positions of the 95th separate assault brigade of the armed forces of Ukraine. And when this brigade, its convoy, was discovered, the Russians attacked this area with cluster rounds. So as you can see, the clashes in this area are very heavy, and we understand why. Because currently the clashes are taking place on the territory of Constantinovka, on the territory of this residential area. If Russians take this area under complete control, then Ukrainians would be forced to fall back further in the central part of the city of Constantinovka. And we need to understand that when clashes starts inside of the city limits of the city of Constantinovka, this will be another very powerful and huge media victory of the armed forces of the Russian Federation. Now the clashes are taking place in the city limits of Pacrovsk, Kupiansk, most likely Constantinovka is the next turn. So, and it seems that the Russians are moving and moving and moving, and despite the fact that currently the Ukrainians control more than 70-60% of these cities, we see that the level of their control is getting less and less and less. As for the city of Pacrovsk itself, as we discussed during the previous days, the Russians launched their third attempt to attack the city of Pacrovsk from the southwest, and during the previous 24 hours, 48 hours, the Russians improved their position significantly. Now, most likely we can say that the southern part of the city of Pacrovsk is already under complete Russian control, and we see that the Russians are changing their vector of offensive. During the previous attempts, the Russians were trying to attack in the direction of the railway station in the central part of the city during the previous two attempts of attack, but this time the Russians changed their vector and they are trying to attack in the western part of the city with the purpose to establish complete control over railways that go from the mainland in the direction of the city of Pacrovsk itself. If Russians somehow are able to take this territory under complete control, we're talking about this residential area, this will lead to complete collapse of the entire Pacrovsk agglomeration and to a cauldron, because from these positions the armed forces of the Russian Federation will be able to establish complete control over the only supply road of 525 to 515 that Ukrainians use to support their contingent. Maybe Ukrainians will not collapse automatically and immediately after such a progress on the ground of the armed forces of the Russian Federation, but this is going to be another step to the end of the battle for the city. Now let's talk about the Zaporizhzhia direction. During the previous 24 hours, additional changes on the ground were recorded. And once again, the third day in a row, just the groups of the 5th Army of the Armored Forces of the Russian Federation continue advancing around the settlements of Novoivanovka, Okhotnichye, and Poltavka. So this is the situation on the ground by the end of the 13th of September of 2025. And this is approximately the moment when the Russians launched their major offensive operation of the group of forces east with the use of the 5th Army. So almost every single day from that day, we were adjusting the map in Russian favor by coloring more and more territories, more and more trenches and strongholds under complete Russian control. At the same time, the Russians stopped completely their offensive operation in the area of responsibilities of the group of the 36th and 29th Army in the northern flank of this area. Most likely, this situation is connected with additional reinforcements and reserves that Syrskyi redeployed in this area to stabilize the situation. But we say that there were not enough of forces from Ukrainian side, so they just managed to stabilize the central and the northern directions, but they haven't managed to stabilize anything in the southern direction. We expect that in coming days, the battle for these two villages will start. We're talking about the village of Akhtirna and Poltavka. Most likely the Russians will try to take this area under control, and if it happens, the Russians will continue offensive operation with the purpose to establish complete control over the village of Uspienovka and the settlements around this area. If Ukrainians lose control over these two strongholds, the entire defense of the Ukrainian army will collapse in this area, and the Russians will be able, without any resistance, to move further in the direction of R85. So the major battle probably is going to start, but once again, the Russians may try not to attack further in the western direction because they will try to use forces and advantageous situation in the northeastern part of the Kharkiv region or maybe in the Kupiansk direction. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds we condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for your watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.